Hello, now we will talk about the object relational behavioral patterns and the way these patterns are relevant in the layer structure of enterprise applications is to manage the persistent entities between the domain logic and data access. And basically they deal with different type of problems related with with, with, with the management of the objects between or the entities between the tables and the domain. So you have several types of problems here. One is when you change something here, okay, how do you know which object can you update in the database? Because look, you have all the objects there, right? You keep accessing the objects, but at the end, when the transaction commits, you need to say, so you need to 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 send some requests to the database in order to update it. And so, how do you manage this? The second problem is when you have your business logic here, you keep accessing the database. And you should be careful if you, in your queries, when you assess the database, inside the same transaction, you ask twice for the same object. Because if you start having two copies of the same object here, things get a bit confused because basically then which one do you change, then they are not synchronized. So how do you deal with this? Okay. And the last one is basically when you get information from the database, actually you have a graph of objects here, and so all the objects in some way are interconnected. And when you read them from the database, you need to decide whether you bring all the objects that are connected with this one, or you just bring some of them. And basically, when you cut bringing objects, and how you easily afterwards you can get the objects. So it's something that you need to decide between I load an object and I bring a lot of objects, or I just bring a small set of objects, and then as I travel in my object graph, I get more objects. Okay, so let's see what we have here about these patterns. So these are the object relational. So the first one is unit of work. And basically in the unit of work, the idea is that you register all the objects that are assessed during your transaction. So you register the new objects, the objects that you create, so that you can afterwards write them in the database, insert them in the database. The dirty objects, which are the objects that actually you read from the database and you change, so you need to update it from in the database. The clean objects that actually you read from the database, we haven't changed, but they may be relevant afterwards to check about conflicts, because so you know which objects you read, so that you see if you are, for instance, read-write conflicts. And then the deleted object. So when you delete an object in memory, okay, so it's necessary that you go at the end, you just delete it in the database. So the idea is to have this entity, and by reading this chapter or this part in the book, we'll learn a little bit about different strategies to implement a unit of work. But the main idea is that every business transaction keeps this unit of work that as you execute your business logic code, this unit of work gets with more objects and actually contains all the things that you accessed and changed, so that at the end you can commit them. Okay, so that is unit of work. Then you have identity map. And the idea of identity map is basically, yes, when you get an object from the database, you need, before you go to the database, it's a good idea to look at the identity map to see if it is already in memory. So if you already assess it, so that you avoid having several copies of the same object. Okay, and then by reading this chapter, we'll see different ways to do it with You have an identity map per, per class or for all the database. Okay. So how do you implement this? Okay. So there are different solutions. And the last one that you need to read is lazy load. And the idea of lazy load is basically instead of every time you need the objects, you just need to do a query. What you do is that when you load an object to memory, this object, the references of other objects, basically, if they are not in the memory yet, they will be lazy loaded when you need to access them. And we'll see different strategies. One of them is use one design pattern that you learned, which is the proxy. Okay, but the idea is that in some point you should, when you load, so you load this object from memory, and other objects that it refers, you're not going to load them. Okay, of course you can load them. For instance, you've used a eager policy, but in some point you need to stop loading because you cannot load all the database. Make no sense for in the context of this transaction you are executing. So what you do is that in that point you need to keep enough information that when you try to access this object, you use this information to load what is necessary from the database. And of course, there's a trade-off, a performance trade-off, whether you load a lot of in advance or you load on a need basis. One of the problems associated with these techniques is identity, because actually sometimes some of the techniques means that what you keep here in memory as a reference to something that you need to load, if you start using the identity of this entity that represents the other one, like a proxy, then it's not actually the identity of the real entity. So if you start comparing objects, it may be a problem or something that you need to deal with, because actually you can have several representations of the same object in memory. So you need to deal with it. So when you read the lazy load, we'll learn about these patterns, how to deal with it. So what we have been, what is these patterns about? Basically about, yes, we need to map them, and you need to preserve some of some qualities or some consistency between the two worlds. Okay, so avoid duplicating entities here. Register everything that is changed here so that you write back, and do not load everything from the database to memory or load them on a need base. Okay, good read.